Good afternoon. My name is Amara Enya, and I am the Policy and Research Coordinator for the Movement for Black Lives. And I'm really excited to host this conversation today on the People's Response Act, but more broadly, the work that's happening in communities across the country around safety and what it takes to create actual safety. So today I'm going to be having a conversation with Beatrice Beckford, who is with Moms Rising. And we're really excited to have her here. And Beatrice, I want to give you a chance to just introduce yourself and the great work that you're doing before we dive into this conversation.
Yeah, thanks, Amara. It's a pleasure to be here with you. Adore you and all the work that you do leading the policy table and organizing us on this important issue. My name is Beatrice Beckford. I go by she, her, y ella también pronouns. I am a national director at Moms Rising, and I oversee our youth and family justice campaigns, which includes all of our school to prison pipeline work, all of our work on mass criminalization and incarceration, and all of our police-free communities, police-free schools, and ending police violence work. I'm happy to be here with you.
Awesome. So we're going to dive right in because there's so much work that you're involved in and so much that is relevant to conversations that are happening right now, especially around the issues of public safety. And then there's this issue of policing. And one thing that I've noticed is that the two are often conflated. When we talk about public safety, we're talking about one set of things. And when we're talking about policing, it's another set of things. So I wanted to just start by getting your take on when you think about the work that Moms Rising is doing and that you've been doing in communities, how do you situate it within the context of public safety and policing?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think you're absolutely right. I think we have been in many ways sifting through a lot of this conflated discourse around policing and safety. And it's been very polarizing in the way that it kind of conflates the two. And ultimately at Moms Rising, what we're saying when we talk about safety and in the context of policing is we're really talking about care, right? And looking at what communities really need to thrive, what communities need to feel safe, all members of our community, right? Even those most vulnerable amongst us, Black, Brown, those with different abilities, Indigenous communities, immigrant communities, what folks need to feel safe in their home spaces, right, in their communities. That does have touch points with policing, right? And we've seen several examples of times in which police do not make communities feel safe. But we also know that there are a multitude of other needs that communities have for families, young people, intergenerationally to thrive. That includes access to certain resources like mental health care, right? It includes ensuring that our schools have the tools and resources they need to support all young people, particularly acknowledging that young people and families navigate trauma on an everyday basis. And those traumas come with them into different spaces that they're in. And that there are things that we can do, right? Professionals that navigate these landscapes to support those young people and to support families and to support communities broadly. So when we talk about safety, we're really talking about care, right? And resourcing communities to have the things that they need to thrive and to not be resourcing things, right? Or programs or institutions that further harm. And so I think, you know, in the wake of an abundance of police murders and situations where we see police engaged in harmful behaviors, it's no shock that these things get conflated, right? Because we have, as a society, an overdependence on police for things that we don't really need to be calling police for. But unfortunately, we also become a society where the easy kind of budgetary thing to do is to rubber stamp police budgets. And so what that ultimately means is that those resources, those essential resources get taken out of communities. It stymies communities' capacity to innovate in the place of public safety, and it prevents essential resources from addressing root causes that have direct interplay with safety. So yeah, I absolutely agree. We're conflating these two things. And ultimately what we all want is for our communities to be safe, and we want to be able to thrive in them. And we can't do that without having a conversation about policing.
You're absolutely right. I think you made some really salient points, particularly around getting to the root causes and the difference between what creates safe communities versus policing. And so I was excited that we're both based in Chicago. So we have sort of an up close view of what happens and just the implications of everything that you mentioned. We have here in Chicago, we have a huge budget that was increased this past year for policing. The previous year was about 1.7 billion, and now it was increased the last year. And so it just represents this continuing approach that we know has not created safety, where whenever it comes to conversations around safety, the answer has always been increasing the budget for policing to the point where it's now a third of the city's budget. And yet the outcomes are not, they're not creating safety for our communities. And so I want to kind of talk with you about the work that you do at Moms Rising. And we talked about care and how safety is about being able to create sort of these communities of care and resources to support care. How has that shown up in your work with Moms Rising?
Yeah, I mean, we talk a lot at Moms Rising, beyond the context of what's happening, in Washington now, but we talk a lot about what it means to really build a care infrastructure. And safety is a huge part of that, right? We talk about, what it means to resource, affordable childcare for families, what it means to ensure that all our families, irregardless of income or background, have access to quality health care. We talk about that in the same context of schools, right? And what it means for young people to have access to quality public education where they can learn in safe environments that they have a hand in shaping, right? That educators have a hand in shaping. But I think the unfortunate reality is we too often see a comfort in ignoring that the care elements of this work and doing more of the same that ultimately is not doesn't get us, as you said so eloquently, to what communities want and need, right? And so we've become comfortable with, when the FOP says sign this contract, we see too many city council members exclude community voice in doing so. I think Chicago is a prime example, right? Where a budget survey happens and the vast majority of participants in that budget survey say, no, we don't want to see an increase to the police budget. We want to see an investment in mental health facilities that over the past 10 years have been mass shutdowns of schools, the largest school closure in American history in the city. And then we wonder why our communities are feeling the way that they're feeling, under-resourced, under these opportunities kind of robbed from them when these spaces are closed, but we see an increase to the police budget. And then when we have, programs and technologies, right? Like there's a huge technology piece to this that we're also doing a lot of work at Moms Rising around, both like in technologies that are used in schools to surveil students, but also technologies that are used in communities to surveil, right? I'm sure you know this, but most recently there's been a lot of interrogation of the ShotSpotter technology in Chicago that an AG's report ultimately showed was ineffective, right? This company gets 20% of its income from the city of Chicago. And you have, city council members like Taliaferro and Dowell who intentionally deny constituents the space to have a voice in it. They deny the data and what the data tells us about this this technology, but continue to spend millions of dollars on it, millions of dollars that could go to the things that Chicagoans have said that they want to see in the city, right? Schools, mental health facilities, services for senior citizens, credible messenger programs, and alternatives that will ultimately help us make this city a safe place for all of us, not just for some of us. And so that's a lot of what we do at Moms Rising. We think about the ways that we address not just issues of safety, but the ways that we support quality of life and the capacity for people to thrive. And we do that by thinking about care. And, I think it's really tricky to talk about care in the context of how people conflate policing and police violence to it. One of the things that we've been spending a lot of time over the past couple of years talking about is police in schools and the role that police play in the lives of children, because we are a kind of, a family-focused organization. And there is so much data and evidence that shows that when schools have the resources to invest in alternatives than to policing in the schools, that we see higher rates of attendance, we see students supported with additional resources. And despite that, we see in schools and in cities this continued, inflation of police budgets, even in times of crisis, right? We saw, recovery funds being used to increase police budgets at a time when the city's residents were saying, don't do that. And we're innovating with community restoration ordinances and programs like Treatment Not Trauma, entities like Good Kids Mad City that are doing incredible work to address, these issues in their own communities, right? And to have the city's leadership ignore that is honestly a microcosm of how the nation ignores that, right? The data on what actually keeps our communities safe. So that's a lot of what we are doing at Moms Rising and talking both at the national level and in our communities.
Well, I'm so glad that you brought up some of the organizations like Good Kids Mad City that developed, I mean, these are young people, developed, drafted an ordinance called the Peace Book Ordinance. Right. They know these issues and they know what it takes to create safety. And they are in many instances leading these conversations. And so it's really incredible to see how they have grasped what they need and how they can address the issues that they're experiencing in their communities. And so it leads me to just this question around urgency. So we know, for example, last year in the uprisings of 2020, in response to the murder of George Floyd, and really a whole host of other issues that were going on with the pandemic, that the movement for Black Lives recognized early on that the millions of people who were out on the streets were not saying, we want police, we're asking for more police. They were calling for justice. They were calling for investment. Many of these frontline organizations with individuals who are deeply embedded in their communities were getting feedback about what communities wanted. And that feedback is what led to the creation of the Breathe Act, which was sort of this overarching policy agenda that really speaks to investing in our people and our communities and divesting from the carceral state. And so with the People's Response Act, it was inspired by that Breathe Act legislation, where now parts of Breathe are being carried by different legislators, which is exciting to see. But what we know is that we saw what happened at the beginning of the year with the Justice and Policing Act, and that didn't go anywhere. And now it's kind of like, well, what's happening? Right, and we're still committed to moving, for example, supporting the People's Response Act and other pieces of legislation. Can you talk about the urgency of why we have to keep pushing on this issue now, regardless of anything else that's happening at the national level, even the local level, why we have to keep pushing on this issue, especially in this moment?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I oftentimes think about what it means when people say, standing on the shoulders of our ancestors, right? And the reality is that Black and Brown communities, low-income working class communities have been fighting against police violence for generations. And that, a big part of how folks have done that is by organizing at multiple levels, right? Both in community, at the state and at the federal level, and arguably globally, right? Because policing is a global epidemic. But the reality is, I think we live in an interesting and a dynamic time right now where communities are not just, not taking no for an answer and being critical of the policies that are being brought up to address, community safety issues, right? I think it's important that you bring up the Justice and Policing Act, right? Because it was kind of brought up as this fix-all for policing issues in the country. And the reality is it didn't go far enough, and it wouldn't have actually protected its namesake, right? It wouldn't have protected George Floyd from losing his life at the hands of this police officer. And so I think what's really dynamic right now is that you have, as we talked about, Good Kids Mad City and the incredible young people across the country, but families, educators, community members are really looking at this question of policing, but also broadly this question of safety. And so I think, one of the things that's really interesting about this conversation that I'm feeling inspired by is the reality that we're looking at you know, to Kimberly Crenshaw's credit, the way in which this intersects all facets of our life, right? And how, you know, for years and years and years, we've seen, you know, schools and community institutions that serve most vulnerable communities have to make draconian cuts, right? Here in Illinois, we saw the Rauner administration close an abundance of mental health facilities and entities that were supporting and resourcing low-income communities, Black and Brown communities, and most significantly on the South and West sides, right? And we see this across the country. It's not just specific to Chicago, but Chicago is a great example. And the response to that is not to is to say no, right? That there are and to interrogate the ways in which cities and states are rubber stamping these kind of police practices, right? So, you know, if we look at what it really means to have a safe community, right? This is what the reimagining is. What makes communities safe? Well, it means that communities have what they need. It means that when folks need access to mental health services, they get what they need. And that the response that we are rejecting and saying no to is if something happens that it immediately needs to amount to criminalization, or that it immediately needs to amount to police intervention. And we know that that is false. And that narrative has to shift, and community members across the country are saying this loud, they're saying it proud, and they're not taking no for an answer because we can't, because we've been fighting too long and too hard and on the backs of our ancestors' work for generations for safe communities. It's not enough, you know, to say, you know, let's get this investigation done because we know what happens. And I think Anjanette Taylor here is a perfect example of that, right? Where we see a Black woman whose house is raided due to police error, and then she is humiliated, and a mayor that will not do anything to be accountable to what happened to ensure that that does not happen to anybody else, right? This lack of accountability. And so the fact that communities are pushing against that and saying, no, we have to look at this issue broadly. And as you said earlier, it's not just an issue, a question of policing, it's about what we mean when we say reimagine public safety. It means that when someone is having a mental health crisis in their communities, that our immediate response is not to call the police officer, because a police officer is not a trained mental health professional. There are professions that are trained at higher levels than police officers are, right? So you have educators that go through onerous licensing processes, right? Years of schooling, right, in classroom management, who then are told, let the police officer in the school handle it, right? Who has no training on anything like that. You have someone who's having a mental health crisis in their community, and a police officer is called because there is no one else, right? There's no other resource that we tell people, if you see someone having a mental health crisis, here is, you know, 611 is for the mental health crisis. We don't have that infrastructure. And so we've set up this conundrum in this country where the only response is police and subsequently criminalization. If someone is homeless or houseless and is navigating, you know, trying to find shelter, and someone, you know, sees them on the street navigating those issues, our response is to call the police instead of to try and find housing and safe shelter for that person, all while seeing these same entities that provide these essential resources in community be defunded, right? And have resources taken away year after year after year. When these are the things that ultimately get us to safety. These are the things that ultimately get us to good quality of life, and care for each other, like to bring this back to what it really is about. I know, you know, and I know you navigate this as well too, as somebody leading in this work. There are very visceral responses people have to the word defund, right? Or any critique of the police. And I think if we could get people to understand that this is really about caring for each other and seeing the humanity in us all, that they would understand this is not about one institution. This is about making our community safer for us all. And that also involves understanding that the response can't always be criminalized. And when we call the police, that's ultimately what we do, because that's what they're trained to: detain, arrest, handcuff, and arrest. And so we need other responses. And that's why I think, the People's Response Act is such an important part of that, because it helps us to look at the root causes of community safety. What are the root causes that ultimately lead to violence? And it allows us to use evidence-based interventions to address those things like violence interruption, credible messenger, resourcing communities, and providing alternate responses that get people what they need and not get them into situations that further harm.
Wow, you have just shared so much. I really, really appreciate your brilliance on this. I mean, you articulated so clearly the goals, what we're looking for when we talk about safety, the alternatives, that there are alternatives, that in society, we have created this situation where the police become the panacea to every issue, every public policy failing, the response is automatically to go to policing, and then the money follows that response as well. And we have to change that paradigm. So, I mean, this is a great conversation. I know we could go on, and I would love to engage you more, but I want folks, before we wrap, to hear how they can get involved with Moms Rising, where they can find some of your work, so that after this conversation, they can be activated to get involved.
Yes, absolutely. So they can visit us at momsrising.org. They can also, if you're a Spanish language speaker, you can visit us at Mamas con Poder, which is our Spanish language sister channel, where we're doing an incredible amount of work on policing also, but also considering the context of immigration with ICE and other elements of law enforcement. And I would also encourage folks, yes, join us and push your legislator to support the People's Response Act. But also, if you're looking at alternatives to calling the police, there are an incredible amount of community groups across the country that have put together dynamic lists of who to call instead of the police on these other things. And I know, if you're here in Chicago with Amara and I, there are great resources for lists of entities that you can call if you're seeing somebody who's having a mental health crisis or navigating houselessness and homelessness. There are folks out there that are able to step in a harm reductionist approach and not put people further into criminalization. And so, if regardless of whether you're in Chicago or not, please, Google and check out, what's happening in your own community as alternatives to calling the police, because that's ultimately how we shift this too, is by shifting how we respond as well. But yes, visit us momsrising.org and Mamas con Poder.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Beatrice Beckford from Moms Rising. Thank you for engaging this conversation today on safety, the People's Response Act, and the great work that's being done. And we hope everyone takes some time and gets activated so that we can all be in this together. Thank you.